In the election of 1796, Washington's vice president, John Adams, one of the great patriots who had helped get this country going, he is elected president, and he is a Federalist. Now, his opponent, the main opposition running against him, was Thomas Jefferson. But the problem was, in the Federalist Party, not all the Federalists liked each other, and there was a little competition there. John Adams was generally a much more likable guy than Hamilton. And Hamilton, he's not a really popular guy among many Federalists, even though his ideology really is the basis for the party. And this kind of shows you why I don't like Hamilton. He decides he's going to try to manipulate the situation. He's going to see if he can flip the ticket. Adams, vice president, is Pinckney. And the way we originally had it set up is the guy who got the most electoral votes is president. And the second most is vice president. We didn't plan for a two-party system. And so the Federalists picked who they wanted as president and who they wanted as vice president. And the electors from the Federalist Party outnumbered Jefferson's electors. So we know the Federalists have won the election. But Hamilton talks to some of the electors and says, hey guys, yeah, cast your vote for Pinckney, but withhold your vote from Adams. And that way, Adams will end up vice president and Pinckney will be president because he's trying to, knock Adams out of it. Well, enough Federalists found out about what he was doing that they made sure this didn't happen. And they talked to some electors. And so on the day the electors cast their votes, a few Federalists withheld their votes from Adams, but more Federalists withheld their vote from Pinckney to make sure he didn't surpass Adams. And what they accidentally did was they got Adams elected president, but their opponent, Thomas Jefferson, ended up with more votes than their vice president had, and he became vice president. And that created a really awkward situation where you've got a Federalist as president, a Democratic Republican as vice president. You know in recent years how well our parties get along. Just imagine if you had the two candidates that had bitterly run against each other in an election having to share the executive branch. It didn't work back then either. Hamilton, excuse me, I keep saying Hamilton. Adams and Jefferson actually had been very good friends throughout the Revolution, but their political ideologies were starting to divide them, and now their friendship is going to be shattered because Jefferson's ideology does not fit with the Federalist ideology. He will find himself on the sidelines almost all the time, so much so that by the end of his term of office, he'll just stay home in Virginia and won't even be in the nation's capital most of the time because he knows no one is going to listen to him. And they will become very bitter rivals. So our first election is our first contested election is kind of rocky. But the Federalists have won. Adams is going to lead. And the big issue that we're facing is this struggle between the French and the English. Now, but we've made a treaty with Britain. Now, we're not recognizing the old Franco-American treaty, and we want a new treaty with France to try to create a neutral situation for us. And we want the French to stop messing with our ships. So we sent ambassadors over to France to try to get a treaty with them. When they got there, our ambassadors were not allowed to go meet with the French government. The Minister of State, Talleyrand, the guy who was there in charge of diplomatic relations, he understood that we Americans didn't know how the game was played. You see, over in Europe, if you want to go talk to somebody's ambassadors and their government, you got to bribe somebody. That's just the way they did it. So our little guys get over there all nice and idealistic, and they want to go meet the government. And so the French kind of have to help us out. So they send these three guys to our guy's hotel to tell them, hey, look, you want to meet with the government, you got to give a bribe. Well, we were insulted because that's not the way it should be. And so our ambassadors came back home, and when it got out to the newspapers, they were a little more polite than they are today. Instead of publishing the names of the three French gentlemen who had demanded the bribe, they simply called them Mr. X, Mr. Y, and Mr. Z. And this is how it becomes known as the XYZ affair. Americans read about it and we're angry. We're not being respected like a real nation because we're just too naive. We don't realize that's how the big nations do each other. But we're insulted. We're not being respected. And this isn't fair. And the French are attacking our merchant ships. And at this point, America is ready for war with France. And there starts to be a big public outcry, and it starts to become very un-American to speak up for France, which is not good if you're a Jeffersonian Republican. These guys liked France. And so Jefferson and his party are really kind of politically hamstrung, and it really raises the popularity of the Federalists. And Adams' approval rating is through the roof. They love this guy because he's going to stand up to the French. And so we begin what's called the Quasi-War, where the United States Navy goes to war with the French Navy. The United States never officially declares this a war, and this sets the precedent for the first time we're having a military action, but we're not declaring war. And that's what we've done throughout most of our history. We've only declared war a very few times. But at war with France is what we are. Our Navy sails out. We're battling French ships on the high seas, and we're doing very well. The USS Constellation defeats the L'Insurgente. The USS Enterprise defeats the Flambeau. And there's a number of U.S. victories over French ships. We actually hold our own pretty well. But the thing is, as this is going on, the Federalists see an opportunity to strengthen their political power in the United States. Now, there's this furor of anti-French emotion, and we're getting ready for war. In fact, Washington volunteers to come out of retirement and lead our troops if we actually go to war with France. And so there's this nationalist wave that goes across America of we're ready for war with France. And in the midst of this, the Federalists pass what are called the Alien and Sedition Acts that on the surface are supposed to protect us during a time of war. In reality, if you look a little closer, it's really a political power play. First of all, there's the Alien Act, which says that the president is able to deport any foreigners that are a threat to our security. Okay, so foreigners might be spying and causing trouble. The Alien Enemies Act says that we can imprison them in case they're causing trouble. The president can lock them up. Okay, maybe they're doing espionage or something. Okay. Then there's the Naturalization Act that now these aliens, when they come to America, they can't become citizens until it's been 14 years instead of the usual 5, because that protects us during a time of war. That's ridiculous. What this is it's a power play. Those immigrants, being immigrants, aren't coming over as rich businessmen. They're working class, or maybe farmers, and they become Democratic Republicans. So by targeting these immigrants, the Federalists are able to intimidate and silence and put off the opportunity to vote for people who were starting to fill the other political party. And then there's the Sedition Act, that you can't criticize the government during a time of war because you got to be on the same team and support our cause. Now, yeah, it's a good idea to all be on the same team if we're fighting a war, but if you can't speak out against your nation's leaders, how can you have democracy? Imagine you couldn't criticize the president. How would you run a political campaign if you can't say why that president's wrong and why you're right? The Sedition Act allowed you to lock up political opponents who spoke out against you. And there were a couple of cases where they actually did lock up a couple of newspapermen who criticized Adams' government. So the Sedition Act really silences that freedom of speech. But the Federalists passed these during this time period, and it gave them what they hoped would be an edge over the Democratic Republicans. Now, things are looking good for Adams. He's nearing time for him to bid for re-election, and he's popular, and people are supporting his quasi-war with France. But at this point, Napoleon rises to power in France, and he says, this isn't a good idea. We don't want trouble with the United States. We've got enough other things to deal with. So U.S., send your ambassadors back here. We'll receive them and we'll make a treaty. We don't want to have enmity with you. Now, Adams gets this word that he can have his treaty with France and make peace. But his election's approaching. Just a few more months. Let a few more people die in battles at sea, and we will have won this election. And don't you know, unfortunately, there's probably a lot of people in our history that would have taken advantage of this because it was so obvious. You just wait a few months and then you make peace. Adams, though, he makes peace before the election. He does what's right. Some of these early guys set a good example for what politicians ought to do. And Adams, well, he's actually kind of wrecked himself politically by doing the right thing, but the right thing is what he does. Adams makes peace with the French. He gets a treaty with them, ending the quasi-war and ending the crisis, which was making him so popular. Well, now it's not un-American to be a Democratic Republican anymore because we're okay with France. And so he ends up losing the next election, which he could have won if he had just kept the crisis going. But he did what was right. He did what was best for the country. And so Adams only serves one term. And as we'll talk about next time, in the election of 1800, Jefferson ultimately wins the election.